I read this week about a first grade teacher who was having kind of a rough day. It had rained the entire day, so the children couldn't go outside and play. So they got more and more restless, they got more and more hyperactive as the day continued on. The teacher couldn't wait for the bell to ring at 3 o'clock so she could go ahead and get these kids out of that classroom. So at about 2:45, she saw that it was still raining outside, so she decided she was going to go ahead and get the kids ready to go home for when the bell did ring. So she sorted out their coats and boots and everything, and she got them all on, down to one last little boy. And she struggled and struggled. The boots were so tight that she couldn't get them on almost, and she's pushing and pushing. There were no straps or no buckles or anything on these boots that he had on. She finally got them on. She stood up and brushed herself off, and the little boy looked up at her and said, "Teacher, these boots aren't mine." She was ready to go home at that point, but she decided, being the good teacher that she was, she knelt back down there and she helped to take those boots off, and turns out they were harder to get off than they were to put on. About that time, the little boy looked up at her and said, "They're not my boots, they're my sister's boots, but I have to wear them." Patience is hard for people to have, and it's even harder for people to display. One writer has defined patience as this: to stay put and stand fast when you'd like to run away. Have you ever felt like that? You ever felt like just running away? I'm sure that Charlie Lubin did. You see, Charlie Lubin made great cheesecake. In fact, his cheesecake was so good that he decided to open a cheesecake store on the north side of Chicago. It went so well that he opened a second store in South Chicago. That store didn't do so well, and eventually he lost both stores. He sat in his room one night, and while eating his cheesecake, he thought, "This is good cheesecake." So he eventually opened his original store again. After a while, he opened another store, which didn't do so well, and again, he lost both stores. A few months later, while eating his cheesecake, he said to himself, "This is good cheesecake." He opened his original store again. He opened a second store again. They both failed. He lost everything. This happened a fourth time. Months later, Charlie sat in his house eating his cheesecake, and he thought to himself, "This sure is good cheesecake." And so he decided to open another store again. Only this time, he would name his cheesecakes after his daughter, Sara Lee. It became the largest bakery in the world. Just think what might have been lost had Charlie Lubin just turned and ran when he faced adversity. Worse yet, just think what the world would be like without Sara Lee. Charlie Lubin did not give up through all the adversity, and it paid off. It's the same with us as Christians. We need to press on, not turn around. Some people seem to have this strange notion that once you become a Christian, everything is fine and dandy, hunky-dory, you're never going to have a problem in the world again. But the fact of the matter is, that's not true. Just because we're Christians, that does not mean everything will be perfect. Jesus tells us in John 16:33, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Jesus tells us right there that things are not going to be perfect in this world. We are going to have trouble. Then in Acts 14:22, Paul warns the believers that they will face many hardships. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. Suffering and hardships are not something that just disappear when you become a Christian. Christians are going to face hardships and suffering in our lives. God is not going to correct all the wrong in the world, at least not until Christ returns. Until that time, we must endure. We must show patience in the midst of suffering. But the real question is, how do we do that? James gives us 3 examples of patient endurance. Over in James chapter 5, James 5, starting at verse 7, we read this: "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. First example that James shares with us is the farmer. Don't you hate it when you have to wait for something and you have no control of the outcome of what you're waiting for? Bumper sticker was seen that told the story of humans trying to control life. Eat right, live right, still die. No matter how hard we try, we cannot control what happens in life. We have to take it as it comes. James gives us an example of patience from a group that has to live that way all the time because they live that way every day because they don't know what the future holds. Look again at verse 7. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. Crops do not appear overnight. Farmer does all that he can, preparing the land and planting the seed, fertilizing, doing all that he can to make sure that there is a good crop that is going to be produced from that land. And then what do? They wait. They wait for the harvest. Farmer has no control over the weather. If it's raining too much, he can't stop it. If it's not raining enough, he can't make it rain more. He has no control over the weather. All the farmer can do is plant the seed and then patiently wait for the harvest. Now, Jewish farmers would plow and sow in what we would refer to as the autumn months. The early rains would soften the soil. The latter rain would come in early spring and help to mature the harvest. The farmer had to wait many weeks for the seed to produce its fruit. Why did he willingly wait so long? He waited so long because the crop was valuable. The harvest was worth the wait. Looking at verse 8 again, we see James picturing the Christian as a spiritual farmer, waiting for a spiritual harvest. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. We need to be just like the farmers who wait patiently. They wait because they know the resulting crop will be worth it. It'll be worth the wait. As believers, we need to wait patiently as God prepares a spiritual harvest in our lives. The secret to endurance through the trials of life is to realize that God is creating a spiritual harvest in our lives. He wants the fruits of the Spirit to grow in our lives. And the only way that those fruits of the Spirit are going to grow is if we have the trials and the difficulties in our lives. God has a purpose for the trials in our lives. James, in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 says, Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Instead of growing impatient, we need to submit to God and allow the fruit of the Spirit to grow in our lives. We are spiritual farmers, and we are looking forward to a spiritual harvest. We do need to remember that the farmer does not just stand around and wait for the crop to pop up out of the ground. He's constantly at work as he looks forward and prepares for that harvest that will be coming. James did not tell these suffering believers to go put on white robes, climb to the top of a mountain, and wait for the Lord to return. They are to be working for the Lord until his return, just as we are. The farmer does not just sit back and wait for the harvest. Christians need to not just sit back and wait for our spiritual harvest. We need to keep working for the Lord. One problem that occurs when you have to wait patiently through trials is that we begin grumbling. And guess who the first ones are that catch the brunt of our grumbling? Those that are closest to us. James tells us in verse 9 to not grumble against one another or we will be judged. Farmers, they seem to always be there to help their neighbors. They're always there for one another when they can. James must have been thinking of that when he wrote this. We need to be like farmers. We need to not get upset with our brothers and sisters because of what we have to endure, but we need to be there to help each other. I like the way one writer stated it. He said this, Impatience with God often leads to impatience with God's people, and this is a sin we must avoid. If we start using the sickles on each other, we will miss the harvest. Let's do what James tells us to do here. Let's learn the lesson about patience from the farmer. Farmers patiently wait for their earthly harvest. We need to patiently wait for our spiritual harvest. Next, we see James talks about the prophets. Matthew 5, verses 10 through 12 says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Being persecuted for your faith is a reality. If you don't think so, just think about what we were just talking about. In Afghanistan right now, there are Christians over there that the Taliban are hunting down. They have hit lists. They're going door to door to find them so they can execute those Christians. Suffering for Christians is a reality. James shares with us in verse 10 of chapter 5 another example of who showed great patience amidst the suffering. James 5 verse 10 says, "Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord." What kind of encouragement can we receive from this example? Well, for one thing, these prophets were in the will of God. They were doing what God wanted them to do, yet they still suffered. They were preaching in the name of the Lord, yet they were persecuted for what they were doing. That gets back to what we mentioned earlier. We seem to have a notion that once we become Christians, all the troubles that we have are going to go away. They're not. Satan has done a great job of convincing people that we are suffering as a result of sin in our lives or unfaithfulness in our lives, when in reality we may be suffering because of faithfulness in our lives, because we are living for the Lord. We need to be careful to not fall into the trap of thinking that obedience automatically produces the easy life. Jesus was obedient, and it led him to the cross. Prophets also offer us encouragement by reminding us that God cares for us when we go through suffering for his sake. If we look over in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, we read this. "Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishba in Gilead said to Ahab, 'As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word.'" Elijah was given the task of telling King Ahab that there was going to be a drought in the land. But Elijah would also be affected by that drought. He wouldn't be able to find water either, just like all the people wouldn't be able to find water. But we see in verses 2 and 3 of that same chapter, 1 Kings 17, that the Lord provides for him. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerioth ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there." Just kind of an aside, never paid attention to that, but did you catch what was just said there? Let's see. "I have ordered the ravens to feed you there." How many of you can order the ravens to do that? It hit me. It's like, man, God's awesome, isn't he? Anyway, I'll get back to what I was talking about now. We see in this God's caring for his prophet. When he was suffering, proclaiming the message that the Lord had told him to proclaim, God provided for him. God took care of him. The drought was going to affect Elijah just like it affected everybody else, but God provided for him through that time. God cares for us when we go through suffering for his sake. Someone has once said, "The will of God will never lead you where the grace of God cannot keep you." When we suffer for the Lord, he will be there to provide for us. The question arises, why do those who speak for the Lord often endure difficult trials? Well, one reason is so that our lives can back up our message. You have to walk the talk. If you're going to say it, you got to live it. It's not enough to say you have patience under suffering. You also need to show that you have patience. The impact of a life lived for the Lord carries great power when others see it. We need to remember that our patience in times of suffering is a testimony to those around us. The important thing that we need to remember is that, like the farmer, we need to keep working. And like the prophets, we need to keep witnessing, no matter what the circumstances may be that we find ourselves in. Our next example is Job. First part of James 5, verse 11 says, "As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered." Those who persevere are considered blessed. When we face trials and difficulties in our lives and we persevere, then we are blessed. The thing is, you cannot persevere if there are no trials in your life. There cannot be victories if there are no battles. There cannot be peaks if there are no valleys. If we want the blessing through perseverance, then we must be willing to carry the burden and fight the battles. Just imagine with me for a minute, if you will. You're sitting in your dining room, you're drinking a Diet Coke. It's a beautiful day. Your life is great. You have a good family. You have great wealth. You own many possessions. You have servants who do everything you ask them to. Life is great. As you're sitting there drinking that Diet Coke, one of your servants comes rushing into the house, out of breath from running so hard. He tells you that they were out in the fields when a band of thieves came along and stole every piece of equipment that was there. They killed all the servants and took everything. Before he even finishes speaking, another servant runs in out of breath. He's been out with others caring for the cattle that you have in the fields. And as they were letting the cattle graze out in the field, a wildfire swept across that field. It consumed the cattle and it consumed the men who were trying to get the cattle out of that field. He was the only one who escaped. Before you even he finishes what he is saying, another servant runs in, and he's out of breath as well. He begins telling you about the horses that were in your stalls. He tells you that at some point a band of thieves came in, they killed all the servants, they took all the horses, they took all of them. There are none who are left. While he is still speaking, another servant runs in. Servant runs up to you and tells you he comes from your son's house. All of your children have been gathered in your son's house. And out of the blue, a strong wind came in and knocked down all the walls and killed everybody that was in that house. He is the only one who survived to come and tell you. What would be your first response if all that happened to you? Would you stand up and yell at God and say, God, how could this happen? I've been faithful servant of yours all my life, and you let this happen to me? Now, obviously, this is loosely based on Job and what took place in his life. It's difficult to find a greater example of suffering than in the life of Job. He lost his wealth. He lost his health. He lost his children that he cared very much about. The only thing he didn't lose was his wife, which might have been a good thing in this case because her only advice to him was, curse God and die. He had friends who stopped by to help him, but they were against him as well. All they told him was, this is obviously your fault. You're lying about something. You have some sin in your life. There's a reason that God is doing this. This kind of stuff doesn't just happen. Job was in a tight spot. It was a difficult time for him. Yet Job endured. He did not abandon God. Satan had predicted that Job would get impatient with God and that he would abandon his faith. But that didn't happen. Job may have questioned God's will, but he did not forsake his faith in God. Job 13:15 says, though he slay me, yet still I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. Job suffered much, but never once did he question that God was still in control. We need to remember that when we find ourselves in the fire, God's hand is on the thermostat. He is in control. Satan wants us to get impatient with God because an impatient Christian is a great tool for Satan. Job is a great example for us. I would venture to say that most of us have not been through the kind of suffering that Job has. And he held up through that suffering, patiently trusting God. When we face difficulties, and we will, we need to be like Job and trust God to lead us through them. Patience is a virtue. Possess it if you can. Found seldom in a woman, never in a man. What about in you? Is patience found in you as a Christian? James has shared some great examples with us to help us develop patience in our lives. We all will face troubles. We all will face suffering in our lives. Just because we are Christians, that does not mean that everything's going to be perfect. We are going to face troubles. Jesus himself told us that. The question we need to consider is how will we handle those difficult times when we are facing them? Will we patiently endure them, or will we complain and grumble and turn against the Lord? We need to follow the examples that James has shared with us. We need to be like the farmer. He prepares his fields, does all that he can to produce a good crop, and then he waits. May not be easy, but he has no choice. All he can do is wait for the harvest to come. As Christians, we need to be like the farmer. God is producing a harvest in us, a spiritual harvest. Through these trials and troubles, the fruit of the Spirit will be developed in our lives. Through those times, we will grow in Christ and we receive blessings if we will patiently wait for the harvest. Now, we need to be actively serving the Lord while we're waiting. Like I said earlier, James didn't tell these folks to put on white robes and go to the top of a hill and wait for Christ to return. They were to be actively about God's work, as we should be as well. We need to be like the farmer and patiently wait for the harvest. We also talked about prophets. They were speaking for the Lord, yet they still endured suffering and trials. Obviously, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean things are going to be automatically perfect for you. These people were serving the Lord, and they still suffered. Then their response to that suffering served as a great example and a witness to those around them. The way that they handled the suffering said volumes about them. When we endure suffering, others see how we respond. Do we turn away from God and say, "Why have you done this to me, God?" Or do we turn to him and say, "Lord, I don't understand, but I know who's in control, and I will trust you"? How we handle the suffering that we face will say much to those around us about us. What are people seeing in you? Patience or impatience? What greater example of suffering do we have than Job? He lost everything, but still he trusted the Lord. He did not turn his back on God, but he stood firm, knowing that God was in control. What an example. Even when his wife told him to forget God, he didn't do it. Even when his friends told him he had sinned and brought this upon himself, he didn't turn against God. Even when he had no response from heaven, he didn't turn from God. He trusted God, and in the end was blessed because of his patient trust. What about us? When we are suffering, do those around us see patience as we wait for the Lord? Do they see the Lord in us? I want to close with these thoughts. Here's some good advice from a 19th century preacher. Beloved, have you ever thought that someday you will not have anything to try you or anyone to vex you again? There will be no opportunity in heaven to learn or to show the spirit of patience, forbearance, and long-suffering. If you are to practice these things, it must be now. Each day affords us countless opportunities to learn patience. Let's not waste those opportunities. What great advice for us. The sufferings we go through will help us to learn. Let's not waste those opportunities.